Okay, everyone, so we've now gotten to the point where we actually have a visualization on our page, and I just want to emphasize that I haven't lost all the rest of my content here, right? It's still there, but it's just been pushed down by this chart. So now what I want to do is talk through how the code that we're using from Google works, and of course, more importantly, how we can customize it with our own data and colors and styles and all of that sort of thing. So I'm going to flip back here to my HTML page, and let's go through and look at, we're going to look at this line by line. So I find, these are helpful, the Google comments, but I'm going to replace these with my own comments. So the first thing is, I've loaded this script, which is just fine, just a normal external loading. And now this is a bunch of JavaScript, which actually I could have in a separate file, and I probably will move it to a separate file. So the first thing that's happening is I am using one of the recipe books from Google. And the way that I can tell is because this statement begins with Google, right? So essentially what I'm saying here is go to the Google library, get the charts recipe book, and now I want you to execute the recipe called load. Okay, so you can think of this literally as a progressive locating of a function. The recipe function is called load, and it's located in the charts cookbook in the Google library. Okay, and that's actually what we call them. We call them libraries. So the first thing is go to the Google library, get the charts recipe book, and make the recipe load. I'm going to say execute the recipe called load. That's more accurate. Execute recipe called load. Okay. And so we notice, you see that they're on different lines here, but we see that we're still talking about round parentheses, so this is a function, just like our own function. And here, instead of, I'm actually going to move this up onto one line so it maybe is a little bit clearer just off the bat. I'm going to compare this to my New York Times function, right? So we see that in the New York Times function, right, we defined this, so that's why it has the function keyword. The Google function that we're using has actually been defined in this JavaScript library that we've loaded, this external script file, which is why we don't see that function declaration, right? It's already there, so now it's more akin to where we would explicitly call that function. And if you recall, when we when we needed to pass specific ingredients to our function, we did so inside those round parentheses. So that's exactly what's happening here. The Google load recipe requires some ingredients. This first one is letting it know which version of the library, which version of the recipe, or really of the charts package that it should be loading. And it used to have this explicit as like version 1, version 2. Now we can just say, look, just load whatever the current one is. These are strings. You'll notice that they have them in single quotation marks. We tend to use double quotation marks. Both are effective as long as they match, right? So I need to make sure that if I start with a single, I close with a single here. Then there's a comma, right? There's simply more than one ingredient needed for this recipe. And hopefully you can recognize at this point that this second element here is, in fact, a JavaScript object, just like the JavaScript objects that we've been making for the last couple of weeks. So the value of the parameter called the key called packages is actually a list. In this case, it's a one-item list, right, that says core chart. All of this is information that's provided to us by Google, right? Google has created the recipe, so it knows what needs to go in it. And in this case, we're just taking from the example, okay, we're going to stick with core chart. Now, as it happens, if we look at the documentation, core chart covers most of the charts that we're going to want to use most of the time. So it allows us to do line charts, bar charts, pie charts, etc. So core chart is going to be just fine for us right now. Okay, this part is saying, so they call this a callback. Okay, so basically what we're saying is, here is we know that we're loading code from elsewhere on the internet, right? Specifically, this gstatic.com website. And sometimes that takes time. So we need to tell our page to only try to make the chart once that code has been loaded. Okay, so the term here in programming is, they describe it as a callback, and I actually like that terminology because I think it's really clear. It's basically like picking up a telephone. So this load function is saying, look, I want you to load this, I want you to load a bunch of stuff, right? It is the package called core chart. I need you to load a bunch of stuff. Well, the problem is that we know, just like when you place a telephone call, you know, the other end, it sometimes takes a minute for the other end to pick up, right? It takes a minute to connect. We see this when we load web pages as well, right? Some things load faster than others. We want to make sure that we don't try to start drawing a chart until we have all of the material back from this load function, right? Until it has successfully picked up the phone, if you will. So that is what this line of code is doing. It says, look, by the way, go to the Google library, and in that charts recipe book, I want you to be sure when you get that call back, right? Or you could think of it as like leaving a message, right? When you get called back with the information you need, then go ahead and draw the chart. Now, what is draw chart? Draw chart is a function which happens to be defined right below. The reason why we can actually call this function, right, seemingly before it is defined, is precisely because this is not going to happen. It's not going to try to draw the chart until it's heard back from the other thing. And by the time it hears back all the way from wherever this Google library is, my computer will have long since finished reading this, like interpreting this function, right? So it might make more sense visually to actually have this down below, right? So it's clear that the function has been defined. But in any case, it's not going to try to do this until it's heard back from Google with the charting package. And by that time, our computer will have read through this code. So this is asynchronous. That's an important part of this. On the one hand, our computer is going to say, okay, go get that stuff from Google, but I'm going to keep reading in the meantime. And by the way, when you hear back from them with the data you need, then we're going to actually execute this function. Now you'll notice again, this is a function that's been defined here, right? We could have written this ourselves. We're using a sample from Google. And so we're going to say, okay, so we're just going to clarify that. I don't know why it leaves that one blank line there. It's kind of annoying. When the material from the Google library has been loaded, we'll execute the function below, which actually draws the chart. Okay. Right? So again, we could really define this anywhere as long as it's somewhere in our scripts. But now let's look at what this is. So they sort of have a comment here like, create the data table. What is that? Again, all we're doing here is, so once again, we're going to use a recipe book in the Google library. This one is called visualization. Visualization. Okay, so now we're creating a variable, decided to call it data. I might call it data table, I don't know. And we're saying, okay, what is data? Well, data is a complex data type. So remember how I said in JavaScript there's only 5 data types? Well, you can create more complicated data types, which is exactly what Google has done, because they've created this thing and they call it a data table. Okay, so again, with this data thing, what we're saying is, look, I want you to create a box in memory, I want you to label it data, and into it I want you to put an object that is going to be created by going to the Google library, right? Going to the visualization recipe book, and you tell it to execute the function called data table. And that is going to do some stuff, right? We don't really need to worry about what that stuff is. But whatever the result of that process is, whatever the output of that recipe, I want you to put it into the box called data. Now we can say, okay, what happens is that we can infer that a data table has functions, has built-in functions. Okay, so again, this is like special stuff that a data table knows how to do, that let us add columns and rows. Okay, which makes sense if it's called a data table, it probably has columns and rows. So that's where we get this data.addColumn, right? So remember that data is a data table, right, which is a data type that has been defined by Google, and apparently it has its own built-in function called addColumn. And that function, we can tell, needs 2 ingredients. It needs apparently a data type, string, which in this case is labeled, it needs a type string, which we're calling topping. We're going to create a second column, which has a data type, which contains numbers, and we're going to call that slices. And then in here, we see something very familiar, right? Which is this is actually an array of arrays, right? So we see mushrooms 3, so it's the name of the topping, the number that appear, the name of the topping, the number that appear, right? So if I were to format, I wonder if it will format this out for me. Yeah, it's keeping it on one line. I would probably do this just to make it clearer, right? So I can see quite clearly that this is an array of arrays. So we recall that we can compose our complex data types, right? You can have an array of arrays, you can have an object of objects, etc., etc. So this is just an array of arrays. This is our data, right? This is the data that's being plotted. Down here, what we have is the place where we customize our chart, okay? This is where a lot of our work is going to come in because we care about things like labels and scales and colors and all of that stuff. Right now, all we're doing is you'll notice that this is an object. This is a JavaScript object. So all I need to do is I can specify the title, the width, the height, all of this. Now again, how do I know what properties this object can have? That's going to come from the Google documentation, okay? So although we've been creating our own JavaScript objects, for the most part when we do this work, we're going to be working in the context of JavaScript structures that have been defined by the libraries that we're using, in this case, the Google Visualization Library. So we'll leave that for now, and let's look at how we actually get this thing on the page. So var chart, so we've created a variable. So create a new variable to hold our pie chart. Okay, and what's happening here is we see, again, we're going to the Google library, the visualization recipe book, we're running a recipe called pie chart, okay, and what that needs is needs an element, needs a div as an ingredient, okay? And we can grab a div by using this document.getElementById function, right? And we pass it the name of the chart div. And then again, we're calling this draw function, which is, again, a built-in function of pie chart, okay? When we come back, we're going to look at how we can customize this.